At pakke, to pack, to wrap. At parkere, to park. At passere, to pass, to go by. At passe, to fit, to take care of, to look after. At pege, to point. At pille, to pick, to peel, to fiddle with. At planlægge, to plan. At pleje, to nurse, to usually do, to take care of. At prale, to boast, to brag. At prøve, to try, to test. At præsentere, to present, to introduce. At producere, to produce. At programmere, to program. At protestere, to protest. At påstå, to claim, to assert. At påvirke, to influence, to affect. At påvirke positivt, to influence positively. At påvirke negativt, to influence negatively. At påføre, to apply, to inflict. At påkalde, to invoke, to call upon. At påklæde, to get dressed. At påpege, to point out. At pålægge, to impose, to instruct. At påmint, to remind. At påvirkes af, to be affected by. At parre, to pair, to mate, animals. At passere grænsen, to cross the border. At pakke ud, to unpack. At pakke sammen, to pack up. At pakke ind, to wrap up. At pege på, to point at. At pille ved, to touch, to tamper with. At pleje nogen, to take care of someone. At planlægge en rejse, to plan a trip. At plante, to plant. At plukke, to pick, flowers, fruit. At presse, to press, to squeeze. At proklamere, to proclaim, to announce. At producere varer, to produce goods. At projektere, to design, to project, engineering. At promovere, to promote. At publicere, to publish. At pumpe, to pump. At pusle, to puzzle, to tinker. At påføre skade, to cause harm. At påtage, to undertake, to assume responsibility. At påvirke miljøet, to affect the environment. At påvirke nogen, to influence someone. At pakke noget ud, to unpack something. At præge, to shape, to influence deeply. At praktisere, to practice, a profession, religion. At prioritere, to prioritize. At proppe, to stuff, to fill tightly. At projicere, to project, to display. At påføre maling, to apply paint. At påvirke følelser, to affect emotions. At påminde nogen om noget, to remind someone of something. At påvirke beslutning, to influence a decision. At pakke bilen, to pack the car. At påvirke resultatet, to affect the result. Learning Danish is not about perfection. It's about practice, patience, and progress. Keep listening, keep repeating. You're building not just words, but confidence. Thank you for learning with Learn Danish Now 365. Let's continue this journey, one word at a time.